Hello, historians. Today, I want to cover some of the basics around our topic this week of ideology of struggle. As always, I am your host, Dr. Summer Cherland, and this is part of a lecture series brought to you by South Mountain Community College. I want to start with an understanding of context. When you're researching and studying history, you're not just looking at events along the timeline. You know, if you think back to classes you took in high school or middle school, and maybe you did or didn't like history, a lot of people who didn't like history tend to not like it because it just feels like names and events, right? It's just dates and names and people I don't know and I don't care about. Well, that's really just like the very tip top of a huge iceberg of information that we look into when we're researching and studying history. Part of the reason we don't love that element of dates and events is because they don't mean anything to us. Instead, what's much more exciting and dynamic is to explore the context. And I talk about context a lot in a lot of our different lectures and activities we do together. So some of this might be familiar to you, but it might be brand new to those of you who have never heard me talk about this before. Context is the world around whatever it is you're talking about, right? So take a look at this diagram, for example. We may be discussing that little star right in the middle of that diagram. It's kind of outlined in a dark brown or kind of maybe a purplish gray. But look at the whole tapestry around that star. We have such a better understanding of what that star's experience might be if we start to explore the lines and shapes and colors of the world around it, right? So when you're learning about dates and times and facts and figures, you shouldn't just be learning about who these people are and what they did. Context tells us a lot about why they mattered, why it was significant, what kinds of forces and challenges and triumphs were surrounding them. So for instance, if you lived during the years of 2020 to 2022, you had interesting things happening. You were in school, you were in relationships, you had jobs, right? But at the same time as all of that was happening, you were being forced into kind of different patterns of behavior based on a global once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, right? That was your context. The pandemic provides the world around the actions that you were taking individually. And sometimes it was seriously significant in your life, and other times maybe it didn't matter so much. That's the point of understanding context. So with today's discussion, when we're talking about the ideologies of struggle, there were three tracks that kind of really influenced the way African Americans talked and thought about their roles in American society. But those weren't out of nowhere, right? Those three concepts, those ideologies didn't come from nothing. They came from this context, the context being the progressive era. You're going to see some words on the screen. Sometimes I'll read them or describe or discuss each bullet. Sometimes I'll just kind of give you a summary. When we talk about the context of the progressive era, here's what I'm talking about. You're like, what was the progressive era? Why does it matter? Well, here's why. So the progressive era is really defined by an intense use of federal power. When I say federal, I mean like the president, Congress, Supreme Court, right? You think about the consolidation of the people at the top, the president and Congress and Supreme Court, that's the federal government. The progressive era was the first time in American history since the Revolutionary War where there was an increase of how the federal government would regulate individual behavior. And this came from a lot of pressure that was on the part of white progressives, right? That's what white progressives wanted at the time. They wanted the federal government to have more control over certain things. Now, whether or not you're a Republican or a Democrat, or you see yourself as a conservative or a liberal, shouldn't affect how you look at the progressives because they lived over 100 years ago. But this is the influence that they had on American life, and it can manifest in ways that probably make your life a little bit better, whether or not you agree with their tactics. The first is the progressives really pushed for federal oversight of corrupt businesses and government bodies. So federal involvement in things that had to do with corporate corruption. This came down to things like factory standards, Prior to the 1920s, there were no child labor laws in America. So kids as young as 10 were working in very high skilled factories that would oftentimes be dangerous for them. There were no expectations that kids be in school, right? That came from the progressive era. There were also some more kind of moral or religious influences in the progressive era, or for the progressives, that came into like campaigns against poverty and homelessness, as well as prostitution or sex work. Another aspect of the progressive era was the 18th Amendment. Now, you probably already kind of know this as abolition, not abolition, as prohibition rather. And this is the forbidden or outlaw manufacturing, trade, transportation, import, export, and sale of alcoholic beverages. Now, you'll notice that the 18th Amendment prohibited the sale and manufacturing of alcohol, not the drinking of alcohol, okay? So it wasn't, you couldn't be found guilty for being intoxicated. You could be found guilty for selling or buying alcohol at the time. Another thing that came that was probably a good thing out of the progressive movement, I believe, was women's suffrage. So the 19th Amendment guaranteed women the right to vote as citizens of the United States. Meanwhile, African Americans are campaigning for their own equal rights and freedoms and an end to white on Black violence, which we've learned about previously in this class and was persisting throughout this era and really up until the 1960s. Another aspect of the progressive era that is outside of this consideration of the federal government's oversight was the emergence of a new Black middle class. I mean, if you think about it, this is the early 20th century. It's maybe only one generation since the Civil War. So this is the first time that Blacks in America are able to access wealth in a way that they never had before, because prior to this, they were either enslaved or they were considered freedmen and women who had bought their own freedom or had been gifted freedom in the North. So this is the first time in American history. This progressive era marks a moment when Blacks were able to access the same kind of wealth, maybe not the same, but close to the same amount of wealth that white middle class Americans had at the same time. Another aspect of context that you should probably remember when we talk about this period in American history is that this is also the era of extreme violence, particularly in the South, but really throughout the whole country. And you'll see an example in just a moment. So this is the era of Jim Crow, and this is the era of significant rise in lynching. So I'll give you a few reminders of what I mean by this. Jim Crow laws and customs. So there's laws which are enforceable by police, arrests and the courts. And there's customs, which are behaviors that are just sort of reinforced by societal expectation, okay? Like don't cut in line at Starbucks or at In-N-Out Burger. That's a custom. No one's going to take you to jail if you cut someone off in line. That might not make you a very good person, but that's the custom, right? Well, there were some nasty racial customs in the South and throughout the American continent that existed during this time. But let's start with laws. Jim Crow laws were actually legally binding restrictions on every single aspect of Black life. I'm not just talking about bathrooms. I'm not just talking about, drinking fountains. When you were in school and you learned about segregation, that was the easiest and most tangible example that your fifth grade teacher could give you, was that Blacks had a drinking fountain and whites had a drinking fountain. Okay, that makes sense to a fifth grade brain, but we're at a really advanced stage when we're talking in a college classroom, right? And you are already grappling with these things. When I'm talking about restrictions between Black behavior and white behavior, I mean what kinds of jobs African Americans could hold. I mean the fact that in the South, African Americans were expected to carry papers with them at all times so they could prove who they were and where they came from. This is a carryover from enslavement. When a slave was traveling from plantation to plantation, or they were going from county to county, they had to carry identification with them at all times, and they were vulnerable to being stopped. This should not be a requirement of a person based on their race, right? So these were restrictions that were placed on people that really impacted every aspect of their life, where they lived, where they worked, who they could marry, what kind of property they could own, okay? Particularly in the South, though to a degree in the North, Black people were confined to Black-only neighborhoods and restaurants and schools. And I'm going to give you a great example. Phoenix, right? Phoenix was founded during this era. Phoenix was founded in the 1880s. This is the turn of the century, post-Civil War, Reconstruction, almost into the progressive era, okay? Phoenix itself was founded in the 1880s, and it was founded in some ways by white progressives. They weren't super excited about the federal oversight, but they were very focused on kind of the moral aspects of progressivism. One of the very first laws that Phoenix Township put on the books before Arizona was even a state was a law restricting where Black people could live in the city. See, the Salt River, you might know the Salt River, it flows kind of right through the middle of town, a little bit south of the middle of town. It flooded every year. And so in the 1880s, I believe it was 1887, white Phoenix lawmakers established a rule. This is a Jim Crow rule that, and it was a law, really a mandate, that white people could literally live anywhere they wanted, but anyone who was Black or Mexican American had to live south of the Salt River because that's where the river flooded, it flooded southward. That's a great tangible example of a Jim Crow law. That's not a custom. That's not a drinking fountain. That's not a bus stop, right? That's where people were even allowed to live because their homes were then vulnerable to flooding regularly, okay? What these laws did not address, though, are rules and customs of racial etiquette. Racial etiquette sort of prescribed how Black people were even allowed to interact with white people. If they violated any of these expectations, they were often beaten or lynched. This was a very dangerous time to be an African American. Okay, when I talk about lynching, and we learned a lot about it last week, we're not just talking about, and take caution with this content, it can be very triggering. We're not just talking about people being hung, which is violent and dangerous and terrible enough. We are talking about thousands of African American men and women who were beaten, murdered, dragged, hanged, all of this, but it was done as a form of public execution. And most of the time, this was done in a vigilante formula, meaning it wasn't an official arrest made and then there was some sort of conflict. I'm talking white citizens enforcing racial etiquette and Jim Crow custom through violence. And the way lynching works is it's a physical public performance of racial etiquette. There's a reason why if you were to just Google lynching, right? Just Google it and look into it. There's a reason why a lot of the pictures involve crowds of people, okay? There's a reason why whites from the North would travel to the South during certain times of year because they were aware that lynching was going to take place and they were there for a form of participation. I don't want to use the word entertainment exactly because it wasn't like, it could be a celebration for some white people, but it was very much a bearing witness of this happening. So I need you to know that lynching wasn't just something that was like a violent one-off. Between 1889 and 1918, approximately 2,460 African Americans were lynched in southern states alone. People were lynched in the West as well. People were lynched in California, and they were lynched in Arizona. They were lynched in Oklahoma. People were lynched in the North, you know, Philadelphia or parts of Pennsylvania. Black men were most vulnerable, though Black women were lynched as well. Oftentimes men were lynched, and these were boys too, boys that were younger than 18. They were lynched because they were accused of murder or rape or advancing towards a white woman. And so it's just important for you to recognize that this was a very dangerous time to be living in America as a Black person. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but another context of this era, another thing that's happening before we even get to that topic of ideologies of struggle, we're talking about context, right? Here's what's happening in the world around these people. Race riots from 1906 to 1921, there were a series of race riots, that's what they were called in the papers, that occurred across the United States. And you can see I have a bunch of examples here. We've got some in Georgia, some in Illinois, some in Chicago, Arkansas, and Tulsa is one of the most famous. One I want to point out is in 1908, there was a riot in Springfield where a Black man was accused of raping a white woman. And as a result, 2 Black people and 4 white people were killed. Over 100 Blacks were injured, and many people lost their homes and businesses in Springfield at the time. And as a result of this bloody riot, the NAACP was established. The NAACP, you might know, is one of the most powerful and prominent Black-led organizations in history. They really were established in response to lynching, but this moment in Springfield kind of sparked the NAACP. And then I'd like you to look up on your own time, if you're interested, the 1921 Tulsa race riot, which is referenced here in the Boston Globe. And then also the 1919 one in Arkansas. I think this is interesting. There was a union meeting. Blacks were meeting as a union, which is an American right that you can meet. And white deputies tried to break it up. And as a result, 12 Black men were sentenced to death, 67 were sent to prison, and there were 0 repercussions for any of the white assailants who were the aggressors in this moment. So that's what's happening, right? That's the progressive era, and that's the kind of racial context of this moment we're talking about in time. So I've given you the story around the star. I've given you the diagram or the tapestry around that middle piece that we're talking about today. Here are some of the leaders that emerged from this moment. There were a significant number of big time names that you'll see in this week's reading and discussion. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois are both 2 of the biggest known names in African American history. These are 2 leaders who took different approaches to bettering the circumstances of African Americans. Marcus Garvey shows up in today's and this week's reading as well. He really focused on Black empowerment, and he inspired the Black working class. We'll talk about the nuances among these 3 men in just a moment. But there was also a rise of anti-lynching leaders. The most prominent and impressive voice comes from Ida B. Wells Barnett, who began writing on lynching as early as the 1880s. Black publications such as The Crisis, the emergence of the National Association of Colored Women, and the NAACP. And Black leaders were not alone in this. There were white liberal organizations, particularly Southern organizations and newspapers, that did support Black efforts to get out of this spirit of kind of racial violence and racial inequities. It's interesting, and I want you to be thinking about like some of the overlaps you see between this era we're talking about in the 1920s and this era we're living in now, the 21st century. Do you see some similarities? Do you see some overlaps? What are some things that are coming to mind for you as a historian, but also as a person just living in the 21st century? Okay, I want to talk to you now about the 3 biggest strategies that you'll find when it comes to the ideology of struggle. The first is going to be accommodationism, which is really kind of coined in 1895. I just use the term accommodation, but you can also use accommodationism as well. This is a quote from the reading. Accommodationism is quintessentially surrendering the promise of an integrated society. Washington, who we'll talk about in a moment, held that social segregation was fine as long as Blacks and whites in the South could come together for things essential for mutual progress. So as I talk about Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Marcus Garvey, I want you to be thinking about like, how much of this theory are you cool with? How much of this theory or concept are you uncomfortable with? You get to decide what you think is a good approach or what you think is a bad approach. Accommodationism is really coined by a guy named Booker T. Washington. And you should look up Booker T. Washington's background. He's an interesting guy, right? I think you should look into each of these guys to see like their own context. Where was he born? What influenced him? What was his perspective? How was he educated? All of those things make up his biography, but they also tell you a lot about his philosophy and ideologies of struggle. Washington coined and wrote and spoke a lot on what he called the Atlanta Compromise. Now, the Atlanta Compromise was a speech he gave in 1895, but it becomes synonymous with Booker T. Washington's ideology, right? He essentially claimed that agreement among the races between whites and blacks could be met if everyone just sort of knew their role. And here were the roles that he suggested. He said, educational trades, meaning labor, right? Not liberal arts education, like not history classes, right? But trades like agriculture, farming, mechanics, blacksmithing, those kinds of things. That these would kind of glorify common labor for blacks. And so what this would do is would actually please whites and guarantee that blacks would never attempt to elevate in society. So he's making a compromise to Southern whites, saying, let's educate freed Black people who are no longer slaves, but let's keep their education to like manual labor stuff. And what that will do is it will provide progress for the South, but it won't let Blacks inch into the middle and upper classes. So it won't threaten white control and white sort of economic authority. In his compromise, Washington offered several guarantees, and these were the guarantees. One, that segregation in the South would continue and should continue. So it's okay if we're segregated, right? Because African-American children will be kind of segregated through labor. They'll be focused on industrial education, while white Southern children can be focused on more kind of intellectual pursuits, like taking English and literature classes, philosophical classes like philosophy or religion, things like that, right? He also suggested that whites and Blacks kind of leave the past behind and just focus on the future. And here's another thing that really caused issue with a lot of other African-American leaders. He suggested that Black leaders, particularly in the South, should discourage any protest or agitation. So no civil rights organizing, no, focus on changing laws or customs. That in his Atlanta Compromise, this would particularly kind of be squashed. Washington doesn't just offer these solutions, he implements them. He becomes the guy who oversees the Tuskegee Institute. You should just Google the Tuskegee Institute. It's the original HBCU, so historically Black college and university. It started on a former plantation. It becomes wildly famous, right? And it becomes significant in the next coming decades. But remember what his focus is on in terms of the Tuskegee Institute. This is not a place for higher learning. This is a place for manual trades training. And one thing I want to point out, though, is that several Tuskegee graduates don't actually fulfill Washington's promise. They go on to elite universities like Harvard and Princeton. So that's Booker T. Washington. Let's talk about W.E.B. Du Bois. So the alternative to the Atlanta Compromise is the Niagara Movement, and this is in 1905. In 1905, Du Bois writes the Declaration of Principles, and he writes this in direct response to the Atlanta Compromise. Now, just like you should look up Booker T. Washington and his background, you should look up Du Bois's background. Where's he from? What's his story? How are their contexts different? Why wouldn't someone like Du Bois like Booker T. Washington's suggestion for industrial education and a compromise with whites? Du Bois had a completely oppositional view in which he called for the complete abolition of any racial caste system. And caste is a ranking, right? He believed that there should be no distinction between who was on top and who was on the bottom. Whereas Washington suggested that whites could maintain their authority and their position on top because Blacks could still be happy down here if they had more access to things like reasonable living wages. The Niagara Movement had three major gatherings, early 1900s, and in it they had 5 demands. So just like Washington had several examples of guarantees, the Niagara Movement and the Du Bois team had 5 requirements, like 5 requests. The right to vote and all the privileges that go with voting. Now, because of Jim Crow customs in the South, African-American men did have the right to vote, but they did not have access to the vote. They were limited in their powers and how they could vote, and they faced violence every time they attempted to vote. An end to discrimination in public accommodations. Now, when I say public accommodations, that's kind of like your swimming pools, your restaurants, your movie theaters, right? Those are places where you can buy and be a customer. So an end to discrimination in any of those public accommodations. The right to assemble, which is a First Amendment right. All citizens of the United States have the right to assemble, meaning the right to gather, protest, worship as a group. Legal enforcement of the law under the 14th and 15th Amendments, which are guaranteed under the Constitution. As you remember from the Civil War, these are from Reconstruction. These are immediately written into the Constitution as a result of the Civil War. And 5, equal education and opportunities for all. So you can see where they're contending with Washington's compromise. They're saying, no, we don't want to be pigeonholed into trades. We want to have access to the same amount of education and the same kind of education that whites have. And we should all have access to what it is we want to study and we want to do. There's nothing wrong with wanting to go into industrial education. There's nothing wrong with wanting to work on cars. But if that's your only choice and you don't have the option to research other things, that's what's wrong, is you should be able to choose what feels best for you. And then the last thing that Du Bois really emphasized, and I'm curious what you all think about this, is he had this concept of the talented 10th, meaning the top 10%, right? This emphasized the need for higher education to develop the potential for the most able, the smartest, the best and the brightest 10% of all African Americans. So although Du Bois has this kind of concept of equality for all, he's still categorizing people, right? He's still acknowledging or believing that some people are brighter and smarter than others. And then we have the third ideology, and this comes from a guy named Marcus Garvey. And there's a quote here from him: "We are the descendants of a people determined to suffer no longer." Now, Garvey, again, look him up, totally different background from Washington and Du Bois, completely different childhood, raised by very different people. And you can see in the picture, he's kind of a flamboyant guy. He becomes a media darling. Oh, I can see my slide got a little messed up. Let me fix it. Okay, I'm back. So you can see that he is a media darling. He is coming of age during a time when newspapers are beginning to publish daily, sometimes multiple times a day, and he attracts a lot of attention from these newspapers, and he's in Harlem. So he founds the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and if you have access to the slides, you can click on this link, which takes you directly to the 8 tenets of the Universal Negro Association, and let's click on it. So if you scroll down, here are the 8 tenets of the UNIA: to champion Negro nationhood by redemption of Africa, to make the Negro race conscious, to breathe ideals of manhood and womanhood into every Negro, to advocate self-determination, to make the Negro world conscious, to print all the news that will be interesting and instructive to the Negro, to instill racial self-help, and to inspire racial love and self-respect. Now, again, you can see how different these two approaches are, this approach is to the other two we just discussed, right? Pretty awesome that there are three different ideologies among these 3 men. Now, remember, I'm using that term because I'm reading from historical documents. That's not I wouldn't use the term Negro today to describe anything of contemporary relevance. So the UNIA generated a lot of racial pride, uplift, economic independence, and your text says, most importantly, a return to Africa. Garvey began promoting this idea that Blacks in America should engage in the plan to go back to Africa, a mass exodus of Blacks in America back to Africa. Well, this can be complicated because remember, these are African American people. These are descendants of slaves who were imported kidnapped, right? Imported, stolen, all of those things and transported to America. But these are their descendants. Most of the folks living in America at this time have no connection to their African heritage because it's been wiped clean from the conditions of slavery. So this is a hard thing that Garvey's trying to accomplish. This is a difficult thing he's trying to convince people of. But because he's a really strong orator, he's really flamboyant, he's kind of charismatic, because of all these things, he's able to kind of garner some support, right? I'll tell you, Garvey was really inspired by Washington. So he's more inspired by Washington's approach than Du Bois's approach. He becomes the founder of this thing called the Black Star Line. And you should look into this in your reading this week. I'm not going to go into it too much, but it's basically a fleet of Black owned and Black operated steamships. As a result of his ownership of the Black Star Line, which you should again read about, he becomes convicted of mail and stock fraud. And as a result, he is imprisoned and eventually exiled to Jamaica. He continues to promote Black nationalism and sort of racial consciousness, but he does so from Jamaica. And later he dies, but I believe his remains are in Jamaica today. So what do you think? I have some questions for you to think about, and I'd love for you to address every one of these questions, but really focus on the one that piques your interest the most. It's not just what do you think, right? It's what can you find out? So historians, as you are, and you're technically a historian, or you're like an apprentice historian in a college class, you don't just regurgitate what I just told you. Like, I just told you some things I know from the reading about these guys, right? Your job is to think about that context again, the world around these men. And your job is to like ponder what you're learning about them and then go find out more information that seems to kind of fill out your understanding. And you can use any one of these 5 questions to do that. 1, what are the major differences you've seen between accommodation and Black nationalism as you saw them? Now, I defined for you accommodation, right? Accommodationism from Booker T. Washington's perspective. But what's Black nationalism? Which side is Black nationalism? Is that Du Bois? Is that Garvey? That would require you to do a little bit more digging, but that's great. That's part of the fun of being a historian. So what are the major differences you saw? 2, do you think the most public leaders, Du Bois, Garvey, Washington, were friends, allies, or rivals? Why do you think this way? So again, you can make a prediction, but then go look for it more. I gave you a little bit of insight about like who inspired Garvey, how Du Bois responded to Washington, right? So I've given you some information, but you need to go find out more. Why do you think they were friends or allies, or do you think they were rivals? 3, where are the women in this history? Why do you think they're left out of this conversation? I mentioned 1, right? Where are they? So again, answer your question, what do you think? But then go find out more information for us and share it. 4, who do you think was paying closest attention to these different strategies? Now, as historians, we're fascinated by these strategies. We're curious, like, why were these guys saying that these 3 ways were the way out of the racial strife of the 20th century? Well, who's listening? Are we talking about like all the Black people in America are tuning in to hear what Du Bois thinks? Or are we saying that, you know, white politicians are really concerned about what Washington says? Or is it just the talented 10 that care? Like, who cares? Who's listening? Who's paying attention? And then 5, what impact do you predict this era had on future movements like civil rights, Black power, and Black Lives Matter? Again, make a prediction, make a claim, but go look for more information about this. I'm telling you, there are hundreds of people making claims about this particular discussion right here, about how the 20th century progressive era ideologies of struggle impacted today's movements on things like Black power and defund the police, those kinds of protest cries. Okay, looking forward to hearing what you think. Thanks, everybody.